Hola, mi gente. Thank you for joining us on the Mano Podcast. I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martin Rivera, Director of Advocacy. In today's episode, we want to talk about significant developments in the 2024 general election, how politics stateside and on the island are shaping federal and local races, and how they relate to our efforts to decolonize Puerto Rico.
And later in the show, we will be joined by Dr. Robert McClure, who is President and CEO of the James Madison Institute. During our conversation, we'll discuss how recent demographic shifts, including the growing Puerto Rican population in Florida, is shaping state and federal elections.
So, let's get started.
All right, Martin. Well, let's kick it off with some updates. What's been happening?
Yeah, well, we are 2 weeks out from the 2024 general election. So Congress is currently out of session. They're back in homes dealing with their campaigns. So for our purposes, and the current action in regards to Puerto Rico's future political status is on the campaign side, specifically on the island. There was actually some recent polling from El Nuevo Dia that gives us a potential outlook as to what the results of the upcoming election will be on the island. And there were three specific issues that caught my eye, specifically in regards to for president. Again, Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, so they don't vote for president, but this is the first time that they're doing an official symbolic vote in regards to the presidential race. And currently, Vice President Kamala Harris would win majority of the vote with 45%, while former President Trump would receive about 30%. 19% are planning not to vote for this on this part of the ballot, and 5% were unsure.
So that's fascinating. It's like a little sneak peek into the possible electoral tendencies of voters in Puerto Rico if Puerto Rico were to become a state and were voting in this presidential election, except because we're a territory, we don't have any participants in the electoral college. So these votes will be symbolic, but ultimately they won't count.
Right. But those results are ironic given the results for the gubernatorial race, which I find interesting because the current Republican resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, would win the gubernatorial race with 44% of the vote, while Jesus Manuel Ortiz, who's the candidate for the Popular Party or the pro-current territory status party, he would receive about 25%, while the pro-independence party candidate, Juan Dalmau, will receive 19% with 8% undecided. But again, this shows something that I believe we've talked about this in the past, that you notice that in the presidential level, President Kamala Harris, she's a Democrat, and she would win that vote if it was official. But for the gubernatorial race, resident commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, staunch Republican, would win the gubernatorial race.
You know, this is exactly direct evidence of what we've been saying on the show all along, that voters in Puerto Rico, they're actually swing voters. They're not just going to vote exclusively for Democrats or for Republicans. They're actually going to vote for the candidates whose campaigns actually speak the most to their specific interests. And it looks like, for better or for worse, at the national level, it's actually Vice President Harris who's been speaking most directly and, most, connecting with Puerto Rican voters on the island. And interestingly enough, at the local level, it's Jennifer Gonzalez, a Republican, who has been connecting the most with voters and getting their support. So I think, again, this is clear evidence. Puerto Ricans are not a monolith. We're swing voters.
Yeah, it just to add to that, it just shows you that if you pay attention to people's needs, you might be able to get their vote.
And if you speak to them in ways that they feel, included and represented by the way that you talk to them. That's fascinating. So what about the status question? Did any of the polls talk about that?
Yeah, so the results on the status question, which currently there's going to be an upcoming plebiscite. It's going to be non-binding, but it reflects the options presented in the Puerto Rico Status Act.
And what are those, just for our listeners?
It's a choice given between statehood, independence, and a version of independence, which is with a compact of free association, which is called COFA.
So what do the polls show? What are people going to support?
So if according to this poll, statehood would win with a 44% support, which mirrored the results of the gubernatorial race. Additionally, 25% would choose free association, 19% would choose independence, and 8% would leave this section either blank or they're still undecided.
So what you're telling me then is that statehood basically has double the amount of support of either one of the other options, right?
Yes. And one thing that I found very interesting, how, like I said, that it mirrored the gubernatorial results, is that it demonstrates that a lot of popular party supporters and a lot of people on the island are still confused as to what free association really is, which is a version of independence with a compact of free association. It's a mutual agreement between two independent nations. It's not what ELA is today, the Estado Libre Asociado, which is an unincorporated territory of the United States, a possession of the United States. Free association is independence. It's completely different.
And I think it makes perfect sense. You know, you mentioned Estado Libre Asociado. That's the Spanish language formal name for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. And it has the words libre asociado, freely associated. The difference is that under the Commonwealth or the Estado Libre Asociado, Puerto Rico is actually a territory that falls under the U.S. Constitution, whereas under free association, libre asociación, it's actually an independent country outside of the Constitution. So clearly there's a lot more education that still needs to be done so that voters can actually provide an informed consent about what it is that they're choosing when they choose free association, which is actually just a form of independence.
That presents a great segue into our next issue. There's been a recent endorsement from two congressional members, Representative Nidia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which both endorsed the Alianza, the joining of the Puerto Rico Independence Party and the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana.
So this is fascinating. Let's break this down a little bit. So you have two of the highest profile Puerto Rican members of Congress, both from New York, that don't have a single voter in Puerto Rico, voting for them. They came down to the island and they decided to endorse this alliance between candidates of the Puerto Rico Independence Party and this Citizens Victory Movement, which is a left-wing, pro-sovereignty, pro-independence party. Is that right?
That's correct. And in my opinion, it's interesting because the biggest losers are the candidates that are enduring the brunt of this endorsement is really the candidates for the popular party in Puerto Rico. The candidate, Jesus Manuel Ortiz for governor, and the one running for resident commissioner, Pablo Jose Hernandez. Representative Velázquez actually emphatically stated her reason why she's not supporting the popular party, and specifically the candidate for resident commissioner. She, and I'm quoting here, he is not willing to present a definition of ELA, that it's outside the territorial clause and is non-colonial. So how can you ask me to support a popular?
That's got to be a really hard hit for them, because the reality is that the grandfather of Pablo Jose Hernandez, Rafael Hernandez Colón, which was the longtime leader of the pro-Commonwealth Popular Democratic Party, he was the one who actually gave Nidia Velázquez her first public office in New York, and that essentially served as a launch pad to her more than 30-some year congressional career, which has led to her becoming one of the most senior Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives today. And yet she's still calling them out and saying, hey, you are still supporting something that doesn't make sense. Puerto Rico can't continue being a colony. And then she's basically kind of taking a side and saying, you know what, I'm not for statehood. I'm actually for independence or independence with free association.
Yeah, like you mentioned, we have to be clear. With this endorsement, it's kind of showing your hand that they support either, again, independence or a version of independence with a compact of free association, which, again, it's an option to voters. It's constitutionally viable. We just disagree that that's the best path for Puerto Rico's future prosperity, because we believe statehood is that path to provide that equality that we need on the island we don't have despite our citizenship because of the status. And that's something that we believe that by Puerto Rico becoming a state of the union, it strengthens Puerto Rico, and it strengthens that multicultural tapestry that is the United States, and that we believe in, and that's why we support statehood.
Definitely. And you know what? I think the other thing is the electoral impact of this endorsement in Puerto Rico is actually also going to be a moment of reflection for voters who have supported the Popular Democratic Party in the past, because they've got to realize that, you know, that's not something that's being supported by anyone in Congress at this time, and that ultimately, when it comes to the plebiscite ballot, they've got to make a choice. Either they choose to go with the folks that want to put Puerto Rico outside of the U.S. Constitution, whether through independence or independence with free association, or for all of those Popular Democratic Party voters that still believe firmly in the permanent union between Puerto Rico and the United States, which I believe are the vast majority of people in that party, and who value their United States citizenship. The only way to guarantee that is actually voting for statehood.
And also, one other thing is that we all agree at the end of the day, like you mentioned, they have their opinion, we have ours. One thing that is the consensus, which is, again, the Puerto Rico Status Act, is that we agree that change must come to Puerto Rico from non-territorial, non-colonial options, and that it should be by a vote of the people, of the voters on the island, and it should be binding on Congress so that we can finally resolve this issue once and for all. And again, that's the Puerto Rico Status Act.
So, Martin, we obviously saw Nidia Velázquez and AOC come down to Puerto Rico, make this endorsement. It covered, is covered widely in the news. We have on the other side of the equation, we've got Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, Republican from Florida, actually also endorsing Jennifer Gonzalez and, putting her hat in the ring in support of her candidacy for governor. So we're seeing how stateside politics is coming to Puerto Rico to try to influence things on the island. But we've also seen some evidence that the politics on the island is actually impacting things stateside. Can you tell us a little bit about what we've seen in that direction?
Yeah, so we've seen attention to Puerto Rican populations in key states that have large Puerto Rican populations. Obviously in Florida, and the issue has come up in debates in Texas, but also in Pennsylvania. It's a key state for both the Trump campaign and also the Harris campaign. And they know that given that Pennsylvania is such a key state and that it's basically a 50-50 state, it can swing either way, that significant Puerto Rican population might decide this election. We've seen endorsements from reggaeton artists for President Trump. We've seen how those efforts have led to significant investment by the Harris campaign to focus on that population in Pennsylvania. So it was even apparent in a Senate debate between current Senator for Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, and his challenger, Mr. McCormick. And one thing that was key is that even in Pennsylvania, they know that supporting statehood is an issue, or supporting at least resolving the Puerto Rico's political status is something that must be taken seriously and that should be advanced, because Senator Casey even stated we should be open to admitting them, saying that if Puerto Rico chooses statehood, the Senate is ready to move forward, or at least start addressing this issue once and for all.
It's fascinating because the issue is highlighting that Puerto Rican voters stateside still care a lot about the future of the island, and that therefore their political representatives should, be at least open to addressing this issue. And another thing that I think is also important that's a recent development is that while we had reggaeton star endorsements be the big news during September, recently we had salsa superstar Mark Anthony actually come out and endorse Kamala Harris, and his whole pitch was reminding voters stateside that are Puerto Rican of some of the deficiencies in how President Trump handled the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And I think that that's something that's particularly resonant now, given all of the recent developments with the hurricanes that have passed and hit Florida and other parts of the country. Just kind of back on people's minds. And Mark Anthony's being like, don't forget this. And by the way, Kamala is probably your best bet. Now, we'll see how those voters react to that. I don't know ultimately what all the celebrity endorsements impacts are, but it's interesting to see how the national political figures are looking to Puerto Rican artists, are looking to this issue to try to see if they can attract those Puerto Rican voters stateside, because they may very well play a crucial role in determining the ultimate outcome of who ends up in the White House.
And that also leads into recent polling from another state, from Florida, my other home state. Again, I was born in Puerto Rico, but I was raised in Florida, so it always hits home when I get to talk about the Sunshine State.
And what does the polling there show?
So this recent Mason-Dixon poll found that majority of Latino voters would support former President Donald Trump over Vice President Kamala Harris.
Interesting.
However, for Puerto Ricans, it showed the majority of Puerto Ricans, 58%, would support Vice President Harris over former President Trump, which shows, just to the issue you were talking about, the disaster response by the Trump administration did have an impact. And we can see that clearly in Florida, where, again, in the 2022 election, sitting governor Ron DeSantis won the Puerto Rican vote with 55% of the vote. And according to this recent polling, it would go to Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, that is interesting. And, those Puerto Rican voters in Florida, they've ended up supporting Rick Scott. They ended up supporting Marco Rubio. They've ended up supporting Ron DeSantis. Yet, it's clear that the figure of Donald Trump has unfortunately not fared as well in the eyes of those voters. So tell us something else.
So on that poll also, which is significant, is that 79% of Puerto Ricans in Florida support statehood. So that, to me, is, especially speaking, as you mentioned, Senator Scott and Governor DeSantis and other politicians in the state, that supporting statehood is a winning issue if you're seeking to get that Puerto Rican electorate. If you want to get their support, supporting statehood, or at the very least, just giving the people of Puerto Rico the right to decide for themselves and honoring their vote, is a winning issue.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into today's interview and our conversation with Dr. Robert McClure. Dr. Robert McClure is president of the James Madison Institute. James Madison Institute is a nonpartisan public policy think tank based in Florida. Dr. McClure was previously appointed by Governor Jeb Bush to the Florida Elections Commission and served on the State of Florida Education Strategic Planning Council. He's an expert on topics related to property rights, tax policy, healthcare, and education reform, and has testified before numerous state and national government bodies. He was also appointed to the Florida Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and was a member of the editorial board for the Journal of School Choice. He's also served as an advisory capacity on the transition teams of Governor Rick Scott and Attorney General Pam Bondi, and served on the Economic Advisory Council for Governor Scott. Thank you for joining us, Dr. McClure. So welcome, Bob McClure, President and CEO of the James Madison Institute, to the Mano Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And would you mind if I called you Bob?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
A lot worse. Yeah.
All right, Bob. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Just for the benefit of our audience and so that they're aware of who you are and what the James Madison Institute is, can you just give us some brief background about the Institute and about, your background so that they're aware about that?
The James Madison Institute is what we call in the business a think tank. We're in the ideas business, George. So really, our focus is on generating well-researched, thoughtful policy ideas that we then work with the legislature, the governor, to advance these policies. And then we do that a lot in Washington, D.C., because we are in Florida, right? Florida's, I would argue, the single most important state when it comes to policy and politics and demographics, which I know we're going to talk a lot about here in a couple of minutes. And so we have a lot of opportunity to work in Washington as well. And so the James Madison Institute focuses on ideas and policies. Now, having said that, our focus is on economic issues, primarily demographic issues, bread and butter type things. We don't deal with Second Amendment. We don't deal with social issues. And so we were founded in 1987. So we have a nearly 40-year history of advancing good policy in Florida. We have a set of principles we believe in. It is kind of that Reagan model of limited government and more free enterprise. You know, we believe really that the best opportunity for everyone, including Puerto Ricans and all Americans and those who hopefully might be Americans through the immigration process, the best opportunity to pursue the American dream is really through limiting government in our daily lives and allowing people more freedom, more opportunity, and more choices in terms of their ability to thrive. And so that's really the role of the James Madison Institute. Your viewers and listeners can learn all about JMI at jamesmadison.org, jamesmadison.org, and we'd love to hear from them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that background on your organization. And obviously, since you are in Florida and, you know, many listeners in our audience care a lot about Florida, some of them are in Florida or have family members in Florida. Before we get into the conversation, how are things in Florida after the two back-to-back major hurricanes? Let's just, hear you on that.
Well, as you know, it's very challenging, and I know Puerto Ricans know that as well as anyone, given recent history, right? So, Helene came through kind of the north central part of the state, not as heavily populated, and yet there was tremendous damage. And then obviously we've seen the pictures of what it's done when it went north into South Carolina, North Carolina, and whatnot.
Yeah,
we're still cleaning up from that. Hurricane Milton came in south of Tampa. And so really there were some population centers, significant ones down there from Sarasota basically to Naples, that southwest corner of the state. There was tremendous devastation in certain pockets. Certain areas seemed to be kind of immune from it. They had some water, but certain pockets of the state were really devastated. I will say this. Florida knows how to do emergency management.
Yeah.
Florida knows how to handle hurricanes. Our governor has been a tremendous leader.
That's great.
He's not a politician who just talks. He is actually a doer. And he had the state as ready as it could be beforehand and ready to roll in as soon as the hurricanes pass through. So having said that, damage, loss of life, what has been done to people's livelihoods is always tragic.
Yeah.
But Florida really can handle that much better than many, many other states. And so we're pleased, but we know that lives were affected, and that's always difficult.
Definitely. I think in Puerto Rico, we can obviously relate to that. We've gone through, very significant storms, particularly the two back-to-back storms in 2017, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, what actually ended up having a significant impact demographically on the Puerto Rican population in Florida. So, sometimes these storms can lead to unexpected outcomes. And for Puerto Rico back in 2017, the movement of citizens from the island to the States and mostly to Florida was one of the biggest impacts. We're still working through that reality on the island, but it has increased both the population and the participation of Puerto Ricans in Florida economically, politically, and in many other, social and cultural ways. Can you tell us a little bit about the Puerto Rican population in Florida, how it's grown, what its importance is?
Well, the Puerto Rican community has grown in significant numbers. 6 years ago when Rick Scott was running for office, it was roughly about a million or so. It's grown probably 20% more than that since.
Wow.
In lots of different ways. Lot of concentrations in and around Orlando, Central Florida area, and then
Kissimmee,
of course,
yeah.
What's that?
Kissimmee, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Osceola County, sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously in the southeastern corridor and then Miami-Dade as well. And what we see is the Puerto Rican community in Florida mirrors the Hispanic community generally in Florida in a lot of ways. We have Argentinians and Venezuelans and obviously Cubans and those things, but the Puerto Rican community kind of mirrors those. And we see the state is now almost 20% Hispanic, depending on what kind of data you look at. Generally, not 20% Puerto Rican, 20% Hispanic. And so it is a major economic driver. It is a major demographic driver. And it is a major political driver in the state. So the Hispanic community is obviously incredibly important. We have our next Speaker of the House is Hispanic. Lieutenant Governor is Hispanic. The community continues to grow. And that's what the Puerto Rican community does. It is mirroring that growth in the Hispanic community here in Florida. And it is an incredible force to be reckoned with.
Well, I think that that's really important for people to understand because, Florida is now the top state nationwide in terms of Puerto Rican population. Right. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is that whereas traditional centers for stateside Puerto Rican communities like New York and Illinois, most of the populations came from groups that left the island. Way back in the 50s and 60s, and in that area, one of the key things that we found is that in Florida, it's the more recent groups that have come on from the island to the States. So their views are different than what you have in the traditional, stateside Puerto Rican centers, which many of which have actually decreased in their population over time, while Florida has continued to grow. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, what we've seen is that the Puerto Rican community, again, mirroring the larger Hispanic community, is they have become, in terms of their views, much more kind of traditional in their views and their values, and we see that in the most recent voting. Governor DeSantis, in his first election, won his race by about 30,000 votes and won a minority of the Hispanic vote in the state of Florida. In his most recent race, he won Florida by more votes than Gavin Newsom won the state of California, which is a stunning statistic. And he won a majority of the Hispanic community. And you see that within the Puerto Rican community as well. He won 62 of 67 counties, including Osceola. And so Miami-Dade. And so what you see is a community that is speaking loudly for their values and their shot at the American dream. And I would add one more thing to that. You talk about the traditional populations in Illinois and in New York. Florida has seen great in-migration from those states across demographics. Right? People are leaving states like New York and leaving states like Illinois and moving to states like Florida for reasons, we would argue, tax reasons, regulatory, being able to start a small business, being able to chase your version of the American dream. New York and Illinois are much more blue, much more challenging in those areas. And so you're seeing the Puerto Rican community, much like the broader community, move from those states to states like Florida. And then when they come over from Puerto Rico, they're not choosing New York and Illinois anymore. They're choosing Florida. And so I think that is also a reflection of the policies that we have enacted here in the state.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that is very interesting about that is that it kind of goes against the grain of this, common talking point that we've heard within politics, where a lot of politicians, particularly on the Republican conservative side, just assume automatically that because voters in Puerto Rico, in Puerto Rican populations stateside, in the traditional Puerto Rican population centers, New York and Illinois and other places, that they've tended to vote Democrat, that automatically the people who come stateside now, or the people on the island at present, that they will automatically lean that way. So I know that one of the things that JMI did was actually do some research on this very topic. Can you talk to us a little bit about the background or research document that you guys released in 2022, and what that research was, and basically what it informed us about this Puerto Rican population?
Sure. The simplest way to say it is that the Puerto Rican community that has come over or has come stateside wants what everybody else wants, and that is their shot at the American dream. They want a better life for themselves, but more so also for their children and for their grandchildren. And so we have seen that, and we saw that with Rick Scott 6 years ago, and that, when elected officials, at least in Florida, look at the needs of the Puerto Rican community, and at least consider or have a discussion about statehood. I'm not here to say one way or the other, but to at least have that discussion, serious discussion, that the Puerto Rican community reacts positively to those elected officials. And I'll give you a perfect example. Rick Scott spent a ton of time on Spanish radio. He spent a ton of time. He even did some Hispanic interviews on Hispanic radio. He spent a lot of money on those communities. He won his race. He took out a sitting U.S. senator, which is almost impossible to do. He did it in a Democratic way. People may not remember that. And he won it by, just a few thousand votes. And if you look at the numbers, particularly in Central Florida, as you and I discussed, he outperformed Ron DeSantis, who didn't quite spend as much time on that community. He outperformed him by, less than 1%. And that may not sound like a lot, but 1% of 8 million votes is 80,000 votes. And
That's a lot.
He won his race by, I think, I can't remember, 10 or 20,000 votes. And there's your difference. So I think what the Puerto Rican community is saying is that when you pay attention to their needs, and their needs aren't different than the needs of many Americans. They worry about immigration. They worry about their future. They worry about inflation, that they react in a positive way in the voting booth for those candidates who are interested in having serious discussions about those issues that affect Puerto Ricans.
And that makes perfect sense. I mean, ultimately, in our electoral system and our constitutional system, the voters have a direct incentive to vote for the members and the candidates that most represent them, that most speak to their values, to their ideals, and to their needs. And I think that what is powerful about what you're saying is that for a lot of candidates and politicians and elected officials right now on the Republican and conservative side, who may be kind of they may have an automatic reflex to just discard the possibility of gaining support from Puerto Rican voters, that there's actually an opportunity, and the opportunity is there by actually engaging these voters on the issues they care about. And now you mentioned statehood briefly, and that's actually a fundamentally important issue, obviously, to us at the Statehood Council and on the Mano Podcast, because, a large part of the driver for the movement of U.S. citizens from Puerto Rico to the states is the fact that under the current territory status, we get treated, unequally under federal laws and programs, and we also don't have full and equal rights to be able to vote at the federal level for U.S. senators, for representatives, or even to vote for president. And when those voters move stateside, because we're natural-born U.S. citizens, we automatically acquire the right to vote stateside. So that's different than a lot of other, Hispanic communities where when they migrate, they still usually have to go through a process of becoming residents, establishing their residency, and eventually after, they fulfill the requirements to apply for citizenship. So how do you see the differences between the Puerto Rican community and some of the other Hispanic communities in the state of Florida? What can we learn from those communities? How are they similar, and how are they different?
Well, I think, what was interesting is that there was very much an open question after the hurricane and the damage that Puerto Rico went through when there was this massive influx of Puerto Ricans to primarily Central Florida, I guess we would argue. And I would say that, when you look at, for years and years and years, people thought the Hispanic community was just Cuban refugees, right? For forever. It was just Cuba. And to a large extent it was. We understand that. But as succeeding generations came along and life events happened, I think you see two things. I think what is similar is that the Hispanic community in general, they all want what most Americans want. And it's this, what I get frustrated with the national media is they want to segment everyone. Right now, it's this discussion about men, Trump versus Kamala Harris, or black men for Kamala Harris. And my answer is always, well, I would argue that black men, white men, Hispanic men, they all want the same things. They want opportunity. They want better lives for their children and their grandchildren. We don't need to segment them in that way. But having said that, it's important, as Rick Scott has done and other successful Florida politicians have done, you can speak to those unique communities because, as you know, Osceola County is nothing like Miami-Dade County, and Miami-Dade County is nothing like the East Coast. And so you can speak specifically without talking down to these communities. And so the Hispanic community writ large is Argentinian. It is, as we said, Colombian, Cuban, and Puerto Rican, and the list goes on. I think where the difference lies for Puerto Ricans is exactly what you said. When they come into America, they then can vote. They are full-fledged citizens. They are the products of a country that is very different than, say, what Cuba was, or what Argentina was, or what Venezuela was, or Colombia. I mean, it was, you had the rule of law. Yes, there's corruption. Yes, we know the issues in Puerto Rico. But generally, and I put that broadly speaking, generally Puerto Rico has elections. It has, a rule of law. It has, those kinds of things that Americans take for granted. And I'm not saying Puerto Ricans take it for granted, but it is a very different mindset when you come into Osceola County from Puerto Rico than if you're coming from Havana, Cuba, into Miami. And so that's where I think the difference lies.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's fundamental for our audience just to have it completely clear. The reason why we have democracy and elections and rule and law in Puerto Rico is because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, because we've been under the American flag, and we know how to participate in a system where you have elections and you have, freedom of speech and, free markets, because that's what the United States has afforded Puerto Rico under the current territory status, albeit with this limitation of a lack of full democratic rights as well as inequality under federal laws. And I think that really goes to this issue of the desire of so many Puerto Ricans, both on the island as well as those that have moved stateside, to see Puerto Rico finally and definitively resolve this issue and this question of its territorial status. And, on the island, we've had a number of plebiscites, most recently in 2012, 2017, and 2020. And each time, voters on the island have rejected the current territory status and favored stateside. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because, all of those voters in Puerto Rico, they look at the rest of Latin America. They look at what's happening in Cuba, even Dominican Republic, which is a country that's, a relatively stable democracy. It's growing economically. It's doing well. But comparatively, I don't think that most Puerto Ricans see themselves moving more towards Latin America. They see themselves moving more towards the standard of living, the opportunities, and the equality and full democracy that people have stateside. And I think that the fact that they have family members in Florida, sharing with them how things are there also creates a feedback loop between the two jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think you're absolutely right. And so this idea of the Puerto Rican community moving into America is very, very different than this idea of, as you said, Latin America, South America, Central America, those countries where many of the rights that you outlined that are kind of taken for granted by Americans and maybe by Puerto Ricans are either non-existent or under threat in some of those other countries. So it's a very different dynamic when all of those groups end up in a state like Florida.
Yeah. And, I think that going back to the desires of folks on the island, if, everyone on the island or the vast majority of voters on the island, they want to aspire to have the opportunity to be treated equally under federal laws and programs, to have, equal voting rights and representation at the federal level. When those voters are moving stateside, what does your research say about those voters? Do they continue being interested in this issue? Is that something that motivates them, or do they just kind of forget about it and not really care? And what should, candidates and elected officials, know about that?
I think absolutely. Our data has shown is that Puerto Ricans don't forget about that issue, statehood, when they move to America. And in fact, in many ways, they vote more conservatively. They have the views that statehood should be considered. So no, they're not. Our data has not shown that they are forgetting about that issue. And in fact, they welcome a serious discussion about it from elected officials. Governor DeSantis, early in his career, was very involved with some legislation as a congressman on this issue. Rick Scott has at least had the discussion about it. These are the state officials at the U.S. Senate level and at the governor's level who are focused on this, not focused, but have had at least serious discussions with the Puerto Rican community. So yes, the community here in Florida still thinks about that statehood issue and is very interested in the views of anyone who chooses to run for statewide office.
No, I think that makes sense. And, another data point that I'd bring to that is that with current legislation in Congress right now that's sponsored by Puerto Rico's current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who's also running for governor in Puerto Rico.
Right.
And has obviously been a member of the Republican Party for her whole life. That legislation, the Puerto Rico Status Act, we see that in the House, it has bipartisan support, and the state that has the most number of Republican supporters is actually from Florida. So I think that, that message that you're saying is actually something that members are taking to heart. They're understanding that this is important for the voters that are Puerto Rican stateside, to engage them, to make sure that they know that that the elected officials and candidates are actually paying attention to their desire to make sure that their brothers and sisters on the island also get the opportunity to at least make a choice about their future, right? Even if the member of Congress or the elected official can't outright endorse statehood, they can at least endorse the choice and making a democratic choice about the future on the island. Obviously, on this podcast, we support statehood. We think it's the best option, not just for people on the island, but obviously for folks, stateside too, because Puerto Rico becoming an independent country would be a mess, and free association is really, just another form of independence. So from our view, we're completely biased on that front. But, we understand and appreciate organizations and think tanks like yourself that may not necessarily take a firm position around, what option would be best, but can at least engage in the conversation about why this topic is important for our elected officials to not dismiss and not just take the common knowledge of, hey, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, it's automatically going to be, all Democrats, when, the electoral results on the island clearly show otherwise. And the data that you're pointing at show that, stateside voters are not necessarily, that easy to stereotype and to paint.
I think absolutely not. And we saw that in the governor's race most recently, where he won 62 of 67 counties. And so you look at this issue, and 62 of 67 counties in a state that is 1/5 Hispanic, broadly speaking. And he won a majority of the Hispanic vote. Having said that, I think this issue is only going to become more intense, because as the Hispanic community continues to grow, as it continues to wield more political clout in Florida, these congressional districts, these congressmen and women in Florida, but it's going to emerge nationally as the Hispanic community continues to grow. There may not be massive Puerto Rican populations in, Arizona, but the Hispanic community is quite larger, or, Texas.
Well, in Pennsylvania right now, the amount of attention that the Puerto Rican community is getting there with, how close that race is for the presidential election and how crucial it is it's grown a lot, the amount of attention that they're getting.
Yeah. So the statehood issue is not going away. It's going to continue to become more and more intense. My concern is that we have yet to sit down and have, as a nation, a serious discussion about Puerto Rican statehood, because I think it gets wrapped into the political season. But as the community grows, as the community continues to wield more and more power at the ballot box and with their pocketbooks, you're going to see, I don't know when, but this issue is going to be moved to the forefront. And as a nation, and certainly as a state, and we started off this whole podcast by saying Florida really is the single most important state in the country when it comes to policy and politics. And so on this issue of statehood, it's going to start here in Florida, the discussion. But what happens here in Florida, apart from this issue on healthcare, on, taxes, on education, if it happens in Florida, the rest of the country ultimately is getting on board. And so Florida has become the California of the 80s. Everything that used to come out of California drove the rest of the country. Everything that comes out of Florida drives the rest of the country. And the issue of statehood will start here has already started here in terms of serious discussions. And that's going to permeate the nation as a whole.
Yeah. And in terms of the factors that could propel this issue to continue growing in importance, we've got two really big things happening on the island. One of them is that we previously mentioned our current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez. She beat Pedro Pierluisi, the current Democratic incumbent governor, in the primary for the pro-statehood party's nomination for the governorship. And right now, she's ahead in the polls by a long shot. So the highest likelihood is that our current pro-statehood resident commissioner will be elected the next governor of Puerto Rico come November. And, she's been someone who has extensively visited Florida. She's been a supporter of numerous Republican candidates within the state. And she's shown her effective capacity to motivate Puerto Rican voters in the state, as well as in other places stateside. So that's one thing that's happening. And then the other big piece that's happening is that on the island on November 5th, they're going to have a plebiscite on the non-territorial status options, where voters will be given the opportunity to choose between statehood, independence, and independence with free association. And right now, the latest polling figures that were released last week by El Nuevo Dia, the largest newspaper on the island, show that statehood is slated to win that vote again. Now, in the JMI report, there's a really important nugget that I want to read for our viewers. And it said, the last referendum in Puerto Rico, referring to the 2020 referendum, produced for the first time an unambiguous majority in favor of statehood. This puts mainland politicians at a crossroads. Republicans especially need to stop thinking about Puerto Rican statehood as some kind of Democratic Party conspiracy to seize power, especially with the voting habits of many Hispanic nationalities shifting. The referendum results mean that political candidates must approach this question sensibly and respectfully, whatever side they ultimately take. So with the incoming potential victory for Jennifer Gonzalez and the expected victory of statehood in the plebiscite, what do you think that's going to generate for existing member of Congress and political candidates in Florida and nationally around this issue?
Well, and I think if you add Jennifer Gonzalez's influence in Washington and the work she's done there, you add what is happening in Washington with her work here in Florida, assuming she wins the race and believing, your polls, I have no knowledge of that, taking it at face value. I think it ramps up the pressure for a serious discussion on this issue. And if your congressional district encompasses, well, I would say all counties in the state of Florida, have the Hispanic community, but certainly in the Central Florida area, the Puerto Rican community, and the South Florida area as well, you're going to be confronted with this issue. You're going to have a serious conversation. But the reality is, it's probably going to start here in Florida with her, with the congressional delegation, the legislature, and who ultimately, is this going to be a discussion when you have people run for governor for Florida? Yes, it's a federal issue, but will it be a discussion? There's 7 or 8 different people that could run for the governorship, and I'm sure Puerto Ricans in Florida are going to want to know where they stand on statehood. It's going to be a huge issue. And because you have a governor who is terming out in Ron DeSantis, you have no incumbent. So it really is going to be kind of a free-for-all.
An open field, yeah.
So I think it'll be a huge issue there. I think nationally, I go back to the concern, and we have to get through this, is that it has gotten the Puerto Rican statehood issue has gotten unfortunately wrapped into this issue of Washington, D.C. statehood and 4 Democratic senators, which I don't agree with at all. I agree with you. But in this election nationally, love Trump or hate Trump, whatever you feel about him, he's doing very well with the Hispanic community. Ron DeSantis did really well with the Hispanic community. You're seeing the Hispanic community trend. Well, their family values, they're much more conservative intuitively anyway. We know that through the data. But they're moving more to the Republican Party. And depending on House and Senate leadership, who's in charge and who wins the White House, you can drive that debate much in a very, very forceful way because of the shift in how the Hispanic voting patterns are occurring.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that the bottom line and takeaway message is that, current members of Congress and political candidates in Florida and elsewhere stateside really do need to be also paying attention to the elections in Puerto Rico, who ends up getting elected for governor, what voters in Puerto Rico choose among the non-territory options in the plebiscite, because it will matter. It will matter during this particular election cycle, and it's going to matter in the upcoming election cycles for Puerto Rican voters in Florida, but also in other places stateside, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and other pockets that we find in crucial swing states.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And it's only going to grow. This is not an issue that's going to dissipate and disappear. It is only going to grow. So that it ultimately is going to be, it's going to have to be confronted.
Definitely.
Where, when, and how. I think it will happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we tend to agree. So, Bob, as we wrap up this conversation, one of the things that I think a lot of folks stateside are also not aware of, which is really, really important to inform our audiences about, is that, there are folks on the island in Puerto Rico, as well as Puerto Ricans stateside, that don't support statehood. Any chance the pro-independence candidate were elected governor in Puerto Rico, what kind of a signal would that send to members of Congress and to Washington about the island? What do you think would possibly be the repercussions if Puerto Rico was put on a path towards independence?
Mm-hmm. I think ultimately, if that were the case, what you might see is more out-migration from Puerto Rico were that to happen. Because unlike people in Cuba and Nicaragua, Puerto Ricans have options.
Yes.
And so I think that might happen. And then and I don't have an answer because I don't have the data on this, you set up a kind of doom loop where Puerto Rico ultimately becomes that left of center bastion because all of those who believe in freedom, believe in the American dream have left the country. Think of, like a California where business owners and middle-class Americans have just left the state in droves because of the draconian tax consequences, because of the regulatory environment. It's almost impossible to start a small business there. The environmental kind of craziness that's required to do anything. So middle class has left. Would you see a similar template in Puerto Rico? That is unknown to me, but is certainly something we've seen happen in other states. We, early in our podcast, we said people are moving to Florida from other states, Puerto Ricans and all demographics. Why is that? Well, it's not just the weather. In Puerto Rico's not moving to Puerto Ricans aren't moving to Florida for the weather, right?
Yep.
It's the same. So it's because they can start a small business. It's because they can raise their children with freedom. They can choose the schools that best fits the needs of their children and their grandchildren. All of those things that are important to all Americans.
Yeah.
So should that candidate win, does it, and it won't happen overnight, does it ultimately create a doom loop? I think Congress, and depending on who's in the White House, will be watching that very carefully in terms of what the repercussions are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, we've already seen Puerto Rico's economy take a massive hit during the last 2 decades as a result of the population loss on the island. And, it's a feedback loop because of territorial inequality and disenfranchisement. The economy isn't able to compete at the same level as the state because we have, a lower starting point. We're not competing on an equal playing field, and therefore more people leave. The more people leave, the less taxpayers you have, the less consumer demand you have, the less labor force you have. So all of these things kind of keep spinning. Personally, I think that if we did have on the outside chance that a Puerto Rican Independence Party candidate were to be elected governor on the island, I think that it would definitely create a circumstance where, that candidate would use their power and their influence to try to, push for independence. And a lot of people on the island would say, you know what, I'm not risking it. I'm moving stateside. And that would hurt Puerto Rico, but it would also hurt the states because the reality is that we have a huge amount of interstate commerce between Puerto Rico and the states. It's about $70 billion every year. Florida is one of the main states that benefits from, exports and imports, to and from Puerto Rico. So if Puerto Rico's economy falters, if it, goes down, if it's destabilized by, these influences that are kind of pulling it more towards the instability of these Latin American countries, I think the probabilities are that, you would also have negative repercussions stateside.
I agree. I think there would be negative repercussions at both ends.
All right. Well, Bob, if our listeners want to find out more information about JMI, where can they connect with you? How can they reach out? How can they find out more?
In terms of policy, broadly speaking, visit jamesmadison.org, and you can learn all you need to know about public policy here in the state of Florida.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bob. Greatly appreciate your time on the show, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you.